The rope snapped tight around her wrists and yanked her off her feet. She hit the dirt hard, the wind knocked clean out of her. A boot pressed down between her shoulder blades and held her there. Above her, two men laughed, passing a bottle while a third went through the saddlebags on her horse. She spat dirt and twisted, but the rope only cut deeper. One of them crouched close to her ear and told her the land would go a lot easier if she just signed. She was alone. No neighbors for miles. No husband anymore. Just a woman on her knees in the dust with three men standing over her. Her name was Sarah Whitlock, and she had buried the last man who tried to protect her. What she did in the next 10 seconds stopped all three of them cold. Stay with me on this one. Let me take you back a few weeks to before any of that happened. Sarah Whitlock ran 40 acres alone, and she had run them alone for 2 years. Her husband Daniel drowned crossing the river during a spring flood, trying to save a calf that wasn't worth his life. They pulled him out a mile downstream. After that, it was just Sarah. No children. No family close enough to matter. Just her, the land, and a whole lot of work that didn't care whether she was grieving or not. Now here's the thing about a widow alone on good land. Every man for 50 miles starts to see an opportunity. Some of them came with flowers and church manners. Some of them came with offers to buy. And some of them, like her neighbor Elias Crane, came with something colder behind their smile. Crane owned the spread that bordered hers to the west. Big cattle operation, deep pockets, and a hunger for the creek that ran through Sarah's property. That water was the whole game out here. Whoever held the creek held the valley. Daniel had held it. Now Sarah did. And Crane wanted it. He'd made 3 offers in 2 years. Each one lower than the last because he figured a woman alone would eventually break. Each time Sarah said no. Polite the first time. Less polite the third. But saying no was getting harder. The fences were falling apart. 2 of her horses had gone half wild without a hand to work them. Winter was coming and she couldn't mend a barn roof and break a horse and run the cattle all by herself. She was proud, but she wasn't stupid. She needed help. And help was exactly what she couldn't trust. That's when Caleb Turner rode in. He came up the road one afternoon at the end of harvest, a drifter on a tired horse, asking if she had work. Sarah stood on her porch with a rifle resting in the crook of her arm and looked him over. She'd learned to look men over quick. He was maybe 34. Lean, sun-worn, quiet. He didn't smile too much or talk too fast, and Sarah had learned that the ones who smiled too much and talked too fast were the ones to watch. He kept his hat in his hands. He looked her in the eye when he spoke, but not in that way some men had, like they were already measuring the house. I can mend fence, he said. Break horses. Fix a roof. I'll work through winter for room and wages, and I'll sleep in the barn. Sarah didn't lower the rifle. Why here? Town's got work. Town's got too many people, Caleb said. And that was all he said. She should have sent him off. Every sensible bone in her body said send him off. A strange man, no references, no history she could check. She'd heard the stories every woman out here had. A drifter takes a job, learns where the money's kept and how the locks work, and one morning you wake up and he's gone and so is everything you own. Or worse. But she looked at the sagging barn roof and the half-wild horses and the fence line going to ruin, and she made a decision she wasn't sure about. Barn's got a stove and a cot, she said. You touch nothing in that house. You come no closer to it than the well. First time I don't like something, you're gone that same hour. Understood. Understood, ma'am. Don't call me ma'am. Sarah's fine. He nodded, put his hat back on and went to work. Didn't even wait to be shown around. He walked straight to the broken section of fence like he'd been doing it his whole life, and by sundown he'd mended 40 feet of it. Sarah watched him from the window that first night. Watched to see if he'd wander toward the house. He didn't. He built a small fire outside the barn, ate what she left him, and turned in when the light was gone. Now here's what mattered about those first days. Caleb kept his distance, and he kept it on purpose. He never once came closer than she told him to. When she brought food out to the barn, he'd step back to give her room. When they worked the same fence line, he stayed a horse length away. It was like he understood, without being told twice, that this woman had been made to feel unsafe by men before, and he wasn't going to be one more. Sarah noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. And slowly, over those first couple of weeks, something in her started to unlock just a little. Not trust. Not yet. But something close to the edge of it. The kind of thing that scared her more than any threat Elias Crane could make. because she knew where trusting a man led. She buried it a mile downstream. The work threw them together whether Sarah liked it or not. You can keep your distance from a stranger when there's 40 feet of fence between you. It's a lot harder when a cow's calving wrong in the middle of the night and you need 4 hands instead of 2. That's what happened about 10 days in. Sarah's best heifer went into labor and the calf was turned the wrong way. Sarah was up to her elbow trying to fix it and she couldn't do it alone. She swallowed her pride and shouted for Caleb. He came running in his shirt sleeves, and without a word he knelt down in the straw beside her and got to work. The two of them spent 3 hours in that barn, freezing and filthy, working together to save that calf. And they saved it. When the little thing finally stood up on shaky legs and found its mother, Sarah laughed out loud, a real laugh, the first one in longer than she could remember. She caught Caleb looking at her when she laughed. Not the way men usually looked at her. He looked at her like her laugh was a good thing to hear, and then he looked away, almost embarrassed, and went back to cleaning up. That was the night the wall started coming down. Just a brick or two. They fell into a rhythm after that. He'd work the fences and the horses through the day. She'd run the cattle and the house. In the evenings they took to sitting on the porch, him on the bottom step, her in the chair, a proper distance between them, and they'd watch the light go down over the valley. Sometimes they talked. Mostly they didn't. The quiet between them was an easy kind of quiet. She learned a few things about him, slowly. He'd had a family once. A wife. He didn't say what happened to her and Sarah didn't ask. She recognized the look. It was the same one she saw in the mirror. He knew what it was to lose someone and to keep going anyway. That was more than most people out here understood. But not everything was quiet. Elias Crane came calling that second week. Rode up bold as day with 2 of his hands behind him. He tipped his hat to Sarah, all smiles, and then his eyes landed on Caleb mending the corral, and the smile tightened. "Didn't know you took on help," Crane said. "Didn't know it was your business," Sarah said. Crane chuckled, but there wasn't any warmth in it. He made his 4th offer for the land right there, higher than before, and Sarah turned it down flat, right there in front of everyone. Crane's jaw worked. He looked at Caleb again, longer this time, like he was filing him away. "A woman alone ought to think careful about her situation," Crane said. "Country's a dangerous place. Accidents happen." "They surely do," Sarah said. "My husband had one. I'm still standing." Crane looked at her a long moment, and whatever he saw in her face, he didn't like it. A woman who'd already lost everything is a hard woman to threaten. There's not much left to take. He gave a short nod, more to himself than to her, and turned his horse. Crane rode off. But the way he'd said accidents sat wrong in Sarah's gut for days. Caleb had heard all of it. That evening on the porch he finally spoke up about it. "That man's going to be trouble," he said quietly. "Elias Crane's been trouble for 2 years," Sarah said. "I can handle Elias Crane." "I don't doubt it." Caleb was quiet a moment. "But you shouldn't have to handle it alone." Sarah looked at him sharp. "Is that what you're here for? To handle it for me?" "No." He met her eyes. "I'm here to mend your fence and break your horses. But if a man like that comes at you, I'm not going to stand in the barn and pretend I didn't see." It was the most he'd said at once since he arrived. And it did something to Sarah, hearing it. Because he hadn't said he'd protect her like she was helpless. He'd said he wouldn't look away. There's a difference, and she felt it. The next week was the best week Sarah had known in 2 years. The barn roof got mended. The wild horses came gentle under Caleb's hands. The fence stood strong all the way around. And in the evenings, the porch talks got longer, and the distance between the bottom step and the chair got a little smaller, though neither of them ever said a word about it. One night she almost reached out and touched his shoulder. Just to know what it felt like to touch someone again. She stopped herself. Pulled her hand back before he ever knew. She wasn't ready. She told herself she wasn't ready. The frost came early that year. One morning the whole valley was silver with it, and the air had that bite that means winter's not far behind. Caleb was up before dawn as always, and Sarah stood at her window with her coffee, watching him move through the frost toward the barn, and she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Something warm. Something that felt dangerously like being safe. She smiled to herself. Set down her coffee. For the first time in 2 years, the day ahead didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a life. She had no idea that 3 men were already riding toward her land through the cold morning fog. The dogs started barking before she saw them. Sarah stepped out onto the porch and there they were, 3 riders coming up her road out of the fog. Not Crane. Men she didn't know. Hard-looking, trail-worn, the kind of men money hires when it doesn't want its own name attached to the job. She knew right away what this was. Crane had stopped making offers. Now he was sending a message. "Caleb," she called, sharp, keeping her eyes on the riders. But Caleb was already coming out of the barn, and she saw with a cold drop in her stomach that he'd gone the long way to check the far horses at first light. He was a good 100 yards off, on foot, too far to help fast. The 3 men rode into her yard and spread out easy like they had all the time in the world. The leader, a big man with a scarred lip, looked down at her from his horse. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Crane sends his regards. Says it's time you reconsidered his offer. We're here to help you see sense." "Get off my land," Sarah said. The man smiled. "See, that's the trouble. It ain't going to be your land much longer." He nodded at one of the others, who swung down off his horse and started toward her with a coil of rope. And that's when Sarah moved for the rifle she kept by the door. She almost made it. Her fingers touched the barrel. But the second man was faster than he looked, and he caught her from behind and threw her down off the porch into the dirt. The rope came down over her wrists and pulled tight and yanked her flat. A boot pressed between her shoulders. The leader crouched by her ear and told her the land would go easier if she just signed. She spat dirt and twisted. It only cut deeper. But here's the thing they didn't count on. Sarah Whitlock had spent 2 years running a ranch alone in hard country, and she had not survived by being helpless. Her hand, pinned under her own body, had found the small knife she kept in her boot for exactly this kind of morning. She got the blade against the rope and sawed once, twice, and her hands came free. She came up off that ground swinging, and she drove the knife handle hard into the groin of the man crouched over her, and he went down howling. She scrambled for the porch and the rifle. The leader shouted. The third man moved to cut her off. And that was the moment everything stopped. Because a gunshot cracked across the yard, and the dirt kicked up right in front of the leader's horse, making it rear. Everyone froze. Sarah froze. The 3 men froze. Caleb stood at the edge of the yard with a rifle to his shoulder, and he had covered that 100 yards faster than any of them thought a man on foot could. His voice came flat and cold across the silence. "Next one goes into a chest. Get off her land." Nobody moved. The 3 men looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at them. And for a long moment the whole yard hung on a knife's edge, nobody breathing. Then the leader, slow, raised his hands. He backed his horse up, helped his howling man up off the ground. And the 3 of them rode out the way they'd come, the leader calling over his shoulder that this wasn't finished, that Crane wouldn't let it end here. Then they were gone, and the yard was quiet, and the only sound was Sarah breathing hard in the dirt. Caleb lowered the rifle and crossed to her. He didn't grab her. He didn't haul her up like she was a sack of feed. He knelt down a respectful arm's length away and he said very quietly, "Are you hurt?" Sarah shook her head. Her wrists were raw and bleeding where the rope had cut, but she wasn't hurt, not really. Caleb nodded. He didn't crowd her. He just stayed there, kneeling in the dirt beside her, close enough to help and far enough to let her breathe, until her hands stopped shaking. The danger had passed. The men were gone. For a moment, kneeling there in the cold morning with the fog lifting off the valley, it felt like the worst was over. Sarah let out a long breath. She almost let herself believe it. Then Caleb reached out and gently turned her wrist over to look at the rope burns, and Sarah flinched so hard she nearly struck him. It wasn't the pain. It was the touch. The first time a man's hand had touched her skin in 2 years. And something in her broke open that had nothing to do with the 3 men who'd just ridden off. Because here's what Sarah understood in that instant, kneeling in the dirt. The threat wasn't Elias Crane anymore. Crane she could fight. Crane she'd been fighting for 2 years. The real danger, the thing that terrified her more than any hired gun, was the man kneeling in front of her holding her wrist like it was made of glass. The danger was that she was starting to need him. And needing someone was the one thing that had already destroyed her once. She pulled her hand back, stood up fast, told him she was fine, told him to get back to work, and walked into the house and shut the door. Caleb didn't follow. Of course he didn't follow. If you're still with me this far, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one only reach people because folks like you stick around to the end. It means more than you know. Because what happened over the next 2 days changed everything. Sarah barely spoke to him. She was fighting herself and losing. Every time she looked out the window and saw him working, steady and quiet, mending the very fence those men had torn down, she felt that warm, dangerous thing rising up in her chest, and she hated it because she knew what it cost to feel it. Caleb gave her room. He always gave her room. But on the second evening, he knocked on the door frame of the house for the first time since he'd arrived, standing back the way she'd told him to, hat in his hands. "Crane's not going to stop," he said. "You know that. Those men will come back, and next time there'll be more of them. You need to go to the marshal in town. File it. Get it on record. If something happens to you out here, somebody needs to know Crane's name. And if I leave even for a day, Crane burns me out while I'm gone," Sarah said. "This land is all I have. I'm not leaving it." "Then I'll go," Caleb said. "I'll ride to town, tell the marshal what I saw, and put Crane's name on paper. You stay and hold the land." He paused. "But I need you to understand something before I do. The second I ride into that town and put my name on a marshal's report, people are going to start asking who I am. And there are reasons I've kept moving. Reasons I don't stay anywhere long." Sarah went still. "What reasons?" And Caleb told her. He told her the thing he'd been carrying since the day he rode in. And it changed the shape of everything she thought she knew about him. He told her about his wife. 3 years back, Caleb had a wife and a small place of his own, 2 territories over. And a man had wanted his land the same way Crane wanted Sarah's. That man sent people. And Caleb had been away buying stock the day they came. He came home to find his house burned and his wife gone. She hadn't made it out. The men who did it were never charged. The one who paid for it was a rich man with the law in his pocket, and when Caleb went to the marshal told him to move along for his own health. So Caleb had done the only thing left to him. He'd gone after them himself. And what he did to the men who killed his wife had put a price on his own name in that territory. Not a bounty exactly, but enough that lawmen who knew the story looked at him twice, and he'd been drifting ever since, staying nowhere, letting nobody close, because everybody he let close seemed to end up paying for it. "So you see," Caleb said quietly, "when I ride into that town and give the marshal my name, there's a chance somebody knows it. And if they do, I'm gone one way or another. That's the risk. I'll still go. But you deserve to know what you're trusting before you trust it." Sarah sat with that for a long moment. And then she understood the whole of it. She understood why he kept his distance. Why he never came closer than the well. Why he looked away when she laughed. It wasn't coldness. It was the opposite. He'd lost a woman he loved to exactly this kind of thing, and he was terrified of being the reason it happened to another one. He kept his distance from Sarah because getting close to him was the most dangerous thing she could do. He'd been protecting her from himself this whole time. That night the temperature dropped hard. The first real freeze of the winter. Sarah lit the stove in the main room, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she opened the door and told Caleb to come inside, that no man should sleep in a barn in that kind of cold. He hesitated at the threshold. Every rule she'd set that first day was standing right there between them. Then he stepped inside and stood by the door, hat in his hands, careful as ever. They sat by the stove. They didn't talk much. And then Sarah, staring into the fire, her voice barely above a whisper, said the thing she'd been holding back for weeks. She was shaking when she said it, and it wasn't from the cold. "Come closer," she said. "And do it. Whatever it is you've been holding back. I'm tired of being alone. Come closer and do it." And here's what Caleb did next. The thing nobody expected. The thing that shocked her most of all. He didn't cross the room and take her in his arms. He didn't do what any other man would have done with an invitation like that, what the whole town would have assumed a drifter would do with a lonely widow. Instead, Caleb stayed exactly where he was. And he said gently, "No. Not like this. Not when you're frightened and grieving and worn down to nothing. If I come closer, Sarah, it's going to be on a day when you're strong and sure and you've got every reason in the world to send me away, and you choose me anyway. Not tonight. Tonight I'm just going to sit here so you're not alone. That's all." And he crossed the room and he sat down on the floor near her chair, not touching her, just near, and he stayed there all night so she wouldn't be alone in the dark. That was the moment Sarah understood the difference. Every man in 2 years had wanted to take something from her. Her land. Her body. Or yes, Caleb was the first one who'd been offered something and refused to take it, because taking it wasn't the same as being given it freely. He didn't want a moment of her weakness. He wanted her whole and strong and sure. He wanted her, not her surrender. She cried then. Quiet in the firelight. 2 years of holding everything alone came out of her, and Caleb didn't try to fix it or stop it. He just stayed near so she wasn't alone with it. And somewhere in that long cold night, the last wall inside her came down for good. Caleb rode to town the next morning and filed everything with the marshal. Crane's name, the 3 men, all of it. And as it turned out, nobody in that town knew Caleb's story. His name meant nothing there. The risk he'd been so afraid of never came. Sometimes the thing we dread the most just quietly passes us by. But Crane wasn't finished. When word reached him that Sarah had gone to the law, he knew his quiet game was over. So he tried one last thing. He rode out himself, with 6 men behind him, to take the land by force before any marshal could get involved. What Crane found when he got there was not a woman alone. Word travels in a valley. The calf Sarah and Caleb saved belonged to a herd, and that herd belonged to neighbors, and those neighbors had watched Elias Crane push and threaten a widow for 2 years and had said nothing because it wasn't their trouble. But a man sending hired guns to rope a woman in her own yard, that was a different thing. That crossed a line even hard men wouldn't stand for. So when Crane rode up Sarah's road with his 6 men, he found Sarah on her porch with her rifle and Caleb beside her, and behind them, spread across the yard, a dozen neighbors who'd come at first light. Ranchers. Farmers. Men and women who'd finally decided that what happened to Sarah could happen to any of them, and it was time to stand. Crane sat his horse and looked at that crowd, and he understood he'd lost. Not to Sarah. Not to Caleb. To a whole valley that had finally had enough of him. The marshal arrived within the hour. Crane's own hired men, facing real charges now, were happy to trade his name for lighter treatment. By spring, Elias Crane had lost his standing, his hired hands, and eventually the case that sent him away. The creek stayed Sarah's. The valley made sure of it. But that's not really the end of the story. The end of the story came later that spring on an ordinary afternoon. Sarah had spent the winter getting strong. The threat was gone. The land was safe. She didn't need anybody anymore, not to survive, not to hold the creek, not to run the place. She'd proven that. She could have sent Caleb on his way with wages and thanks, and stood on her own 2 feet and been just fine. And that was exactly the point. One afternoon in spring, Sarah found Caleb out by the corral, working a young horse in the sun. She walked out to him and she stood there a while watching him. And then she said his name. He turned. "You told me once," Sarah said, "that if you ever came closer, it'd have to be on a day when I was strong and sure, and had every reason to send you away and chose you anyway." She took a breath. "Well, here I am. Strong as I've ever been. Don't need a single thing from you. Could run you off this land right now and never miss a step." She looked him dead in the eye. "And I'm asking you to stay. Not because I need you. Because I want you. That's the difference, isn't it? That's what you were waiting for." Caleb stood there in the sun, and for the first time since the day he'd ridden in, that quiet, careful man's eyes filled up. "That's the difference," he said. And this time, when she reached out and took his hand, he didn't pull away and he didn't hold back. He held on. They were married that summer, out under the cottonwoods by the creek, with the whole valley there to see it. Sarah wore her mother's dress. Caleb couldn't stop looking at her, and this time he didn't look away. The same neighbors who'd stood in her yard against Crane stood witness now, and afterward there was fiddle music and a long table of food, and Sarah laughed that real laugh again, the one Caleb had first heard in a freezing barn over a newborn calf. He heard it 100 times that day, and he figured he'd be glad to hear it every day for the rest of his life. The land stayed theirs. The creek ran clear through it year after year. And the man who'd once kept his distance out of fear never kept it again, because he'd finally learned the thing Sarah taught him that cold winter night, the same thing she'd learned from him. Being wanted is not the same as being needed. And being cared for is not the same as being owned. Sarah Whitlock had buried one good man and spent 2 years believing that was the end of her heart. She was wrong. Some mornings the fog lifts off the valley, and the frost turns to silver, and a person gets one more chance at the thing they thought was gone for good. She almost turned him away at the door with a rifle, that first afternoon. She thought about it a long time after, how close she'd come. The best thing that ever happened to her, standing in her yard with his hat in his hands, and she nearly sent him down the road. Thank God she didn't.